Hey friends, happy Sunday. So I think I'm going to start making my videos on Sunday just to keep it consistent. But what I want to do in this video is I want to do another video on spiritual enlightenment. And this video is going to be on Advaita Vedanta. And how Advaita Vedanta is actually a pretty strong pointer to spiritual enlightenment. But I don't think it captures it. But I want to tell you what I think it does capture and why it's important on the path. So I think the first thing that you have to understand is that there appears to be a consciousness behind all of the change that's happening in your life. So no matter what's happening, right, there's a you that's sitting up underneath or behind everything that's happening. Or maybe it's not a you. Who's to say, right? That's a philosophical proposition, but maybe it's not a you or whatever. Who's to say? Or maybe that the behind metaphor isn't entirely true. See, again, it's like we're dealing with the intersection between the semantic layer and the existential layer, or between words and experience. But both seem to be here. Like, to try to put one in the shadow to the exclusion of the other is also kind of an error. Let me see if I can fix the lighting here a little bit. So, but Advaita Vedanta, This is one of the best philosophical ways to awaken. It's called jnana yoga, or jnana yoga, or the way of knowledge. So there's, different pathways that you can take towards spiritual enlightenment. You can use psychedelics, you can use knowledge, you can use worship, you can use relationship, you can use religion, whatever it is, right? There's different pathways. It's like in philosophy, there's different ways. You can think of philosophy as a big pool. And there are many ways to enter that pool. You can enter the philosophical pool through science, through mathematics, through art, through music. Because ultimately what you're looking for is you're looking for the intersection between the existential, the relational, and the semantic. The interplay between those systems. And but that's kind of like, intellect mastery, cognitive understanding. But then also being sits up underneath that, right? The body sits up underneath the mind, to use a metaphor. So you don't need the mind to legitimize the body. You don't need the body to legitimize the mind. Right? These are all just sort of like sense-making systems. So what Advaita Vedanta teaches you is that there is a sense in which you have a being that sits up underneath all change. And there are many ways to label this. You can call it consciousness, you can call it anything. But also, too, Advaita Vedanta is, just like Zen, aware of the limitations of language. Like when you say consciousness is X, Y, or Z, you would immediately know that that's not true, right? Because if you're conscious of consciousness, you see thought for what it is. But then you also, too, you realize, too, that, there are many cases where you're not thinking that you're also thinking. So, for example, individuating things is also thinking, or identification with the dream is also thinking. It involves an assumption that's not often expressed explicitly. Like, I am this person, right, who's operating in the dream. So there's the semantic, like, so basically what Advaita Vedanta teaches you is that attachment to the ego just is samsara, and that there's a way of liberation through jnana, which is knowledge. But it's not just knowledge, it's like a higher knowledge. And the higher knowledge is that you really don't know who you are or what you are, and you really don't know what thought is. You don't know how thought relates with experience. So there's something missing in your like there's some kind of awareness that's missing. And because of this, you cannot become spiritually enlightened. You're going to be attached to the finite, right? You're going to be attached to some kind of limited thing. So the sales proposition is that there's some kind of an answer, okay, because it's jnana, right? It's knowledge. So there's some kind of an answer to the problem of suffering on some level. So it's very optimistic, right, in that way, that there's an answer to suffering on some level. Sounds a lot like religion, doesn't it? Like Christianity, the good news, right? The good news of Jesus Christ and how Jesus Christ came down and saved all of us and blah, blah, blah. So there's a religious component to Advaita Vedanta too. It's called salvation. Soteriology, I think it's what it's called in philosophy, to use a highfalutin term. I try not to be highfalutin because, the more basic, it's like, every chef is a great cook, right? So if you're not a great cook, you're never going to be a great chef. So every great philosopher has to be like a great human being. Without being a great human being, you can't be a great philosopher, right? Otherwise, you're just going to be up your own ass. You're going to be some kind of weird, you're going to be doing some weird shit, right? And it's not, nobody's going to resonate with it. So, that said, what Advaita Vedanta teaches you is something about what we might call God consciousness. Now, this is different than solipsism. And I like the word God. In this context, I think I do. So, on some level, there's really nothing here but your consciousness. And you might say even ultimately. But that's no way to go through life, right? Because on some level, you're attached to the changing world. So it's it's basically a conflict between the unchanging and the changing. And I think that's what we're seeking for with the semantic layer ultimately. And I think this is why spirituality has a semantic layer to it. Because there is an understanding, right, that's ultimately a pointer, but it's necessary on the path, which is, I am sovereign. I am creating my reality on this like deeper existential level, right? And I think this is definitely something you have to go through on the path. I don't think it's the highest stage, because you also need integration of the relation and integration of emptiness and integration of not even. But this is more like for truth, like integration of truth. So you're going to go through a phase on the path where you're focused on truth, which is some kind of a narrative that you take to be a kind of a pointer that you're clinging to. Okay. And Advaita Vedanta is a good one. And the reason why it's a good one is because there's a lot of suffering that's caused by not making a distinction between chatter and intuition. So intuition is your insight. It's your inner guidance. It's intelligence. It's the intellect side of being when it comes to consciousness. But then, how do we make a distinction between that and chatter? The monkey mind. And then how do we not hate that, right? So like, on the one hand, like, you know, you're looking at the lower side of yourself. You might call that samsara, right? The human power struggles, power games, office politics, positioning. And the higher side of things, which is more like detachment. You know, you ever read the Bhagavad Gita? Right? That has more to do with Indian philosophy in general, not just with Advaita Vedanta. But which is actually very similar to the Bible. I mean, if you look at how Arjuna was treated by... if you look at how Arjuna was treated by God, it's similar to the way Abraham was treated by God. This world doesn't matter. See? And I think that's where it goes a little too far. Becomes a little too religious. A little too idealistic. Consciousness is attached to the ego too. Like if truth, ultimately, I think what truth is getting all these things right within your own life. But then also realizing too that these pointers can be emptied, including Advaita Vedanta, including Zen, including Jung, including Spinoza, including Plotinus, including whatever it is, whatever ideology that you have, right? That can be emptied too, and then not even. Not even is really the pinnacle, where you just kind of bask. You bask in the plurality and also the singularity, the paradox between the singularity and the plurality. But I think Advaita Vedanta is a great pointer toward the singularity. I mean, solipsism is kind of a different angle at kind of getting at this, but consciousness, right, is a good angle for getting at this too. it's the idea that changelessness is here just as much as change is here. This is where like philosophy also kind of comes into it too. This is Indian philosophy, not just spirituality, but philosophy. We think, oh, it's got to be process or singularity or change and no change. Like what? Like that's just a semantic layer that's sitting on top of experience. So you have to be able to kind of examine both and then not even, right? See, that's the intellect mastery part of spiritual enlightenment. Is that yes and no and not even. Okay, friends, so I'm halfway through the video. I'm going to come back. I'll do the second half. Just give me 1 second. All right, friends, welcome back. So what I want to impress on you guys is that Indian spirituality is in part philosophy. And really what we should be thinking in terms of is world philosophy. And so what I want to do in the second half of this video is I want to talk about Spinoza, Advaita Vedanta, Jung, and Zen, and beyond Zen. So, see, you got to realize that like people come out of a cultural milieu, just like an aesthetic milieu, right? So like a genre of music, unless you're creating a new aesthetic, which is rare. And I'll do a video on aesthetics. I think that might be my next video, is on aesthetics. But what I want to do is I want to talk about kind of the aesthetics of Spinoza, Advaita Vedanta, Jung, and Zen, or the pointers of these, right? Just you as, a being or whatever, and not even. So Spinoza felt like there was just like in the West, like if you look at Western philosophy, that there's a link between intellect and extension. This goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. There's a link between logos and experience. And there's a distinction between logos and mythos too in Western philosophy. And logos is the general principles that explain the nature of reality intellectually. So Spinoza was very much a piece of this tradition in the West. And he postulated that what we're missing is the relation. That in fact, reality is not a system of nodes. It's a giant relation. And so therefore, he postulated an idealism that corrects for a mistaken theory of individualism. So you can see how he follows Plato. Plato thought that people were confused. They're in the cave, right? They have to be sort of like therapeutically brought out of the cave. So you can see how Spinoza very much follows in this kind of idealistic tradition of Plato. But the problem isn't that people don't understand the forms. It's that people don't understand that they're not people. So you see this kind of Indian philosophy, right, kind of influence on Spinoza, whether or not he knew that or not. I mean, or maybe this just happened in Jewish mysticism and it happened to, kind of correlate with what was going on in India. But this is old. This is Vedanta, right, basically. We'll talk about that in Advaita Vedanta, which is the next one. So here, the proposition is another form of idealism. It's that the way reality appears to be is not the way that it actually is. And so it raises the issue of truth, right? Truth versus falsity is a clear dichotomy. Similarly with Spinoza. So there's a philosophical component here, a general component, a semantic layer that tells you that the way that you ordinarily feel and think and blah, 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 is an illusion or a delusion. I'm never sure which one of those words it is, but it's either a delusion or an illusion, or both. But Advaita Vedanta wants to point you to the fact that there's a stable, unchanging thing behind the changing. Spinoza would make the same kind of argument. He would say it was the whole. Spinoza would say it would be the whole. And Advaita Vedanta, it would be the self with a capital S. And we might call this God. Okay? So this is where you have your non-duality versus God realization. I'm just looking over at my whiteboard here. So, people talk about God realization. Yeah, this is the Advaita Vedanta is kind of the pointer to this, right? The individual sovereignty. But then, you can take it further than Advaita Vedanta. And people have. But I think it's all kind of the same kind of layer. And then after this, you move into understanding that you got to deal with shadow work, right? Like, the intellect is defensive. The ego is defensive. God is defensive in ways that you don't understand. And because of the fact that you don't understand this, you're stuck, right, with that. Because you're trying to teach that or whatever. I don't know what you're doing. But you're stuck there. Once you move into shadow work, this is when you really start to develop a kind of existential compassion. Because you realize that you've done everything that bad people are... I mean, not everything, but you've done analogous things that bad people do. You may not specifically, but... And you're not entirely good either. Nor do you have to be. Right? So your ego, you learn how to integrate your shadow. You learn how to heal your traumas. You learn how to get off your need to be right and understand why that happened. It's like a therapeutic stage, actually, on the path. Okay? And then so after Jung, you have Zen. And you see how Zen requires, you got to go through some of these, earlier things. You don't become a great chef without first becoming a great cook. You don't become a great jazz trumpet player without first becoming a great trumpet player. See? You have to master the fundamentals. That's required. Otherwise, you do become kind of a just a semantic kind of mouthpiece. And I've done that too, right? I mean, we do that. We have to do that. But it's when you reach mastery is there's no more insecurity. And that's kind of what Zen is. So Zen is about practice, performance, balance, also acceptance, getting away from truth, getting away from emptiness, right? Even getting away from Buddhism, non-duality, philosophy, and just living, right? Being, see, without philosophical components to it. Now, I have 2 additional layers beyond this, just in terms of pointers. The next one I would call calling. See, Zen still kind of assumes that like nothing is important, right? Just kind of like you're just allowing, but like from like a practical kind of reintegration of the root. But there's a higher stage where you really start to realize that that you're tapped into an intelligence, a mystical intelligence, and that your life is actually a demonstration or a teaching, not just to you, but to others. And it's not about you. You're being... Your avatar is actually not being controlled by you. From an egoic perspective. You're like a log that's being pushed around on a body of water, right? More so than you realize. But it's happening for a greater reason, a greater purpose. This is what religion gets right. But it's like a primitive, it's like stage purple trying to dictate to stage turquoise, right? Or stage turquoise trying to dictate to stage purple. They're speaking different languages, right? And then after this stage, it's a consciousness of power, right? And how consciousness structures power. And so far, this is the highest, kind of highest stage that I've come to, when it comes to spiritual enlightenment and development, is consciousness of power. And also being able to attach to power, but then also surrender to power too. And realize that it's not like there's just like the ups and downs of life versus peace. It's not that simple. See, it's not that dichotomous. It's not that the intellect is not correspondent to reality entirely. It's more subtle than that. See, you're still trying to grab it through the intellect. You're trying to rope it in through the intellect. You're still trying to do that, right? But don't stop trying to do that either. You see what I'm saying? I mean, all of this on some level is a glorification of the concept of limiting beliefs and how limiting beliefs hang you up. I mean, this goes all the way back to like basic self-help. So spiritual enlightenment is just it's almost like it's like the black belt of somebody who understands the nature of limiting beliefs. Basically. So, but don't forget that you're a white belt too. Never forget that you're a white belt. Never stop being a cook if you're a chef. Never stop being a cook if you're a chef, right? You got to be a great cook to be a great chef. You got to be a great performer on a musical instrument to play jazz. To be a jazz musician, right? You got to be good at playing a musical instrument. Got to have some like basic skills. So that's exactly what all these pointers are in spiritual enlightenment. So as a spiritual enlightenment guide, in this video and in the last video, I've given you guys a lot of pointers. But ultimately, That's all it is talk. So hopefully, though, this was good, and I'll talk to you soon. I'll talk to you next week. Take care.